Good evening all. Can I be seen and heard? Give me a wave if I can. Excellent. Good evening. Well, I'm Jim Mallinson, chair of the SOAS Centre for Yoga Studies. The centre's it's always been quite virtual. It's a sort of institutional setup for getting anyone who's working on yoga at SOAS, either students and researchers and people beyond, to meet and share their research. And of course, we've now gone very virtual. So the last few months, every fortnight, we've been having a lecture series on Zoom. And so this evening, we're very lucky. We've got Dr Mikel Burley, who is the Associate Professor of Religion and Philosophy at the University of Leeds. He's extremely well published. I've just been checking up on his publications list. It's extremely impressive. Recent major publications include Rebirth and the Stream of Life, a philosophical study of reincarnation, karma and ethics, Bloomsbury, which came out in 2016. 2007, Routledge, Classical Sāṃkhya and Yoga, an Indian Metaphysics of Experience, which will be informing tonight's talk. And I think Impress, not quite yet published, is A Radical Pluralist Philosophy of Religion, Cross-Cultural, Multi-Religious, Interdisciplinary. Sorry, is that right, Mick? Yeah.
It was published in January, but I haven't had time to update the website yet. Yeah.
Sorry, okay. Well, I haven't seen it yet, but congratulations. So Mick is going to talk on, the title of his talk, Sāṃkhya and Yoga are two important and related Indian philosophies, but how does the theory of Sāṃkhya relate to the practice of yoga? Okay, so we're going to hear about that. Now, during the talk, the Slido site will be open, the Slido page, which you should have got information about that in the event email. So you can put questions on there, okay? And at the end, I will look at the questions. If you put your name on and you want to say the question yourself, we can then switch to you. If not, I can just, if it's anonymous, I'll just read a question. And that's about it. The only thing, I just keep an eye out on our Facebook and Instagram pages to see what future events we've got. So now it just remains for me to hand over to Mick. Thanks very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jim, for that kind introduction, and to the whole of the SOAS Yoga Studies Centre for the invitation to participate in this seminar series, and also to Martha for the technical assistance that's been invaluable. I'm a little underexperienced with the Zoom technology, but let's see whether it can work for me this evening. So I'm going to have a go at sharing my screen now. Just trying to enlarge the slide. There we are. Okay. So yes, I was informed that people involved with the Yoga Studies Centre might be interested in my interpretation of Sāṃkhya philosophy, and also its relation to yoga practice. So that's what I've chosen as my topic, and hence the title, Sāṃkhya philosophy and yoga practice, how are they related? And I'll aim to speak for around 45 minutes or so to allow some time for questions and discussion at the end. So I'll begin by mentioning briefly what the images are on this first slide. On the left is a statue of Kapila, who is traditionally regarded as the founder of Samkhya. And on the right is a statue of Patañjali, who is regarded as the author of the text on classical yoga known as the Yoga Sūtra or Yoga Śāstra. And in the middle is the deity Lord Vishnu, sitting upon the 1,000-headed serpent named Ananta or Adishesha. Now, according to legend, Kapila is an incarnation or avatar of Vishnu, and Patañjali is an avatar of Adishesha, hence the snake's tail in the statue of Patañjali. So here we might say, with these three images together, is a visual mythological depiction of the close, intimate relationship between Sāṃkhya and Yoga. Now, I won't be saying any more about those particular images, but the relationship between Sāṃkhya and Yoga is obviously my theme. So what I'll be saying in the talk, as Jim suggested, is a summary of some key ideas from my 2007 book, Classical Sāṃkhya and Yoga, an Indian Metaphysics of Experience. And in a nutshell, what I argue in the book is that Sāṃkhya philosophy is best understood as an analysis of the constitutive conditions of possible experience, and that these constitutive conditions are precisely what has to be disidentified with through the process of yoga meditation in order to achieve the spiritual or soteriological goal that is common to Sāṃkhya and Yoga, known as, among other things, Kaivalya, literally aloneness. Now, it'll be tricky to get the argument across in a relatively short presentation such as this, but I'll try to convey at least the basic outline. Let's begin by considering what Sāṃkhya and Yoga are in their so-called classical forms. These terms, classical Sāṃkhya and classical Yoga, standardly apply to the philosophies articulated in the texts known as the Sāṃkhya Kārikā and Patañjali Yoga Śāstra, respectively, with the latter of these comprising the Yoga Sūtra plus its primary commentary, the Yoga Bhāshya or Yoga Sūtra Bhāshya. The Patañjali Yoga Śāstra is so named because it's attributed to Patañjali. The Sāṃkhya Kārikā, meanwhile, is attributed to Īśvarakṛṣṇa, though Īśvarakṛṣṇa claims merely to be expounding the ideas passed down from the Paramarshi, the highest sage, namely Kapila. Now, obviously, I don't have time now to expound Sāṃkhya and Yoga philosophy in their entirety, but I'll highlight some key elements. So, the central theme of yoga, and indeed of Sāṃkhya, is encapsulated in the opening four statements or sutras of the Patañjali Yoga Śāstra, which are these. The first sutra simply announces that what's to follow is an account of the teachings of yoga, Atta Yoganuṣāsanam. The second sutra then provides a pithy definition of yoga, Yoga Cittavritti Nirodha. Yoga is or consists in the cessation of the activities, or more literally the turnings, vritti, of the mind, citta. And the third sutra reads then, that is when the turnings have been quelled or brought to quiescence, the siya, drashta, the ultimate experiencer or center of consciousness, abides in its own form, swarupa. And Sutra 4, at other times, that is when the turnings have not been quelled, the siya abides in or assumes the form of the activities or turnings of the mind. In other words, the true self is somehow falsely identified with mental activities. Within the context of the text as a whole, we can read these sutras to mean that the goal of yoga is to engender a state in which the siya or self or center of consciousness is liberated from misidentification with the mental activities. It abides in its own form in the sense of abiding in a state of pure, undisturbed consciousness. There are, of course, lots of interpretive issues about what exactly that would mean in practice, but I'll have to leave those issues aside, at least for the time being. Turning then to the text known as the Sāṃkhya Kārikā, central to its teachings is a system of categorization. We might call it an ontological or metaphysical system, a system that divides reality up into a set of categories. At the heart of the system is a fundamental dualism between two principles named Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha in this context is a synonym of drashta, which I translated as the siya in the sutras from the Patañjali Yoga Śāstra that we just looked at. It is the true self consisting in pure consciousness. At least that's how it's defined in the Sāṃkhya Kārikā. Prakriti, meanwhile, is normally translated as nature or matter. It's the source of everything that is not Purusha, of everything that is experienced or experienceable. And it's said to have a threefold structure comprising the three gunas or strands, about which I'll say a bit more later. Now, according to Sāṃkhya, when these two principles, Purusha and Prakriti, come into proximity with each other in some metaphysical rather than spatial sense of proximity, then a creative emergence, kritaha sargaha, takes place. The emergence, that is, of 23 further principles or tattvas, which are sometimes referred to in translations as evolutes or manifestations of Prakriti. Crucially, the 22nd verse or Kārikā of the Sāṃkhya Kārikā reads as follows. From Prakriti comes the great, Mahat, which seems to be a term that in other places the term Buddhi is used to as a synonym for. And from that comes Ahankara. From that, the group of 16 further principles. And from 5 of those, namely the Tanmatras, come the 5 bhutas. Now, I've left a lot of the key Sanskrit terms untranslated there. So let's turn to a diagrammatic representation, which includes some approximate English translations. Some of these translations are by no means uncontroversial, but most of them are fairly standard. If we look at the first principle below Prakriti, we see that I've used the term intentional consciousness to render it. In this context, Buddhi is more often rendered as intellect, but I'm deliberately giving it a more phenomenological inflection for reasons that I hope will become clear later on. Intentional consciousness here means simply consciousness of or consciousness about something, as distinct from the pure consciousness that is the essence of Purusha. And Ahankara, in the center of the diagram, literally means I maker, that which makes an ego. Here I've translated it as egoity. And beneath Ahankara are 21 further principles comprising 4 groups of 5 plus manas, the mind. And I'll be returning to this diagram as I proceed, so I won't go through all the principles now. Since the central question of my paper could be put in terms of what does this metaphysical or ontological system, this set of categories, have to do with yoga practice and with the goal of achieving liberation, the abiding of the Siya or Purusha in its own form. Now, the common view of the relation between Sāṃkhya and Yoga in general is that they are, in a sense, 2 sides or aspects of the same overall system. Here, for example, is Pulindahari Chakravarti making this point. Sāṃkhya, he says, is specially busy, or especially concerned, we might say, with the theoretical investigation, whereas the other yoga deals with the practical side. Speaking briefly, the 2 systems are nothing but the concave and convex side of the same sphere. There are good reasons for accepting this view, or something like it, but I'd put it more in terms of a complementarity of emphases. Yes, yoga is, as explicated in the Patañjali Yoga Śāstra, is concerned with practice, but it's also, as the colophons of the Yoga Bhāshya commentary put it, an exposition of Sāṃkhya. So classical yoga is itself a form of Sāṃkhya, with a certain emphasis on practice. And the Sāṃkhya Kārikā is indeed more concerned with setting out the conceptual or theoretical framework that complements the practice. What I'm not claiming is that the specific texts known as the Sāṃkhya Kārikā and Patañjali Yoga Śāstra were deliberately composed to be complementary siblings, as it were. I don't think we have any historical evidence for that. Rather, what I'm proposing is, in brief, that the type of philosophy that we find in the Sāṃkhya Kārikā is a conceptual and theoretical complement to the type of nexus of conceptual and practical themes that we find in the Patañjali Yoga Śāstra. And moreover, we gain a deeper understanding of them both by studying them in relation to each other. There have, however, been some dissenters from this view, such as Georg Feuerstein, for one, who, in his book on the philosophy of classical yoga, tries to drive a wedge between yoga and Sāṃkhya. His view is that, quote, it is vital to realize that the methodological differences between classical Sāṃkhya and yoga initiated important conceptual and doctrinal divergences, which further increased the chasm between these two schools of thought. Now, there are indeed some terminological differences between the Sāṃkhya Kārikā and the Patañjali Yoga Śāstra, and some apparent conceptual differences as well. But to describe these differences in terms of a chasm is, in my view, extravagant. Among the many important similarities are these. Both the Sāṃkhya Kārikā and Yoga Śāstra, like Buddhism, in fact, characterize that which is to be transcended or escaped from in terms of dukkha, suffering, dissatisfactoriness, distress, etc. They both use the term Kaivalya several times to denote the final goal. Kaivalya being literally aloneness or solitariness, the abiding of the seer or purusha in itself, in its own form. The Sāṃkhya Kārikā uses the term purusha, but the term drashtratva, or seerness, the quality of being a seer, features in its definition of purusha. And the Yoga Śāstra uses both purusha and drashta more or less interchangeably. And then there's prakriti. This term does occur in the Yoga Śāstra, but more often the term drishya, that which is seen or seeable, is used. But there's no obvious conceptual difference between this and the notion of prakriti, especially in the sense of prakriti as that which becomes manifest or expressed. Now, this slide is a bit complicated. It shows a table from my book in which some technical terms from Yoga Sūtra chapter 2, Sutra 19 are correlated with conceptually equivalent or analogous terms that occur in the Sāṃkhya Kārikā. What Sutra 19 actually says is that everything that is constituted by the gunas being the structuring components of prakriti, can be divided into 4 basic categories, and these are listed on the left side of the table. First, alinga, that which is imperceptible or unmanifest. Second, linga matra, that which is a mere sign or mark. In other words, that which merely indicates that there is something or other. Third, avishesha, the non-specific or non-particular factors. And fourth, vishesha, the specific or particularized factors. Now, interestingly, the Yoga Bhāshya commentary on this sutra provides an analysis of these 4 divisions or categories, and does so by explicating them, each of them, in terms that are more or less familiar from other Sāṃkhya sources, including the Sāṃkhya Kārikā, although the commentary does not overtly cite the Sāṃkhya Kārikā itself. In any case, I won't run through the whole analysis here, but the correlation further supports the view that there is a relation of complementarity between the versions of Sāṃkhya presented in the Sāṃkhya Kārikā and Yoga Śāstra, respectively. And of course, if anyone wants to give closer attention to this particular slide, you can pause it on YouTube. But I'll move on. And to discuss a difficulty. So a difficulty of interpreting how the Sāṃkhya ontology relates to yoga practice derives from the fact that the ontology seems to lend itself to both a cosmological or cosmogonic and a psychological reading. I'm using the term cosmogonic or cosmogonic here in the sense of a cosmogony, that is an account of how the cosmos or universe came into existence. On a cosmological or cosmogonic reading, therefore, Sāṃkhya's account of the emergence of the 23 manifest principles is to be understood as an account of the formation of cosmic reality, the formation of the universe as a whole. On the psychological reading, by contrast, it's an account of the formation of each of us as a psychological or psychophysical being. As Rodney Parrott notes at the end of the quotation on this slide, the bit that's underlined, this Sāṃkhya Kārikā presents the essences, the tattvas, as both cosmic and psychological phenomena. Or rather, I would add, it presents them in a way that could be interpreted in cosmic or psychological terms. But there's a further problem, which is that regardless of whether one adopts the cosmogonic or the psychological reading, it remains unclear what the ontological system has to do with the goal of achieving Kaivalya. As Gerald Larson puts it, quote, Sāṃkhya's theory of evolution has very little to do with the problem of salvation, since in any given life, evolution is already accomplished before that particular life begins. And hence, Larson concludes that the exposition of the Sāṃkhya Kārikā on this point leaves much to be desired. Larson's contention here is that even if one treats the Sāṃkhya ontology as an account of how or the order in which a person's psychological faculties come into existence, it's far from obvious how that information contributes towards the practical aspiration for the liberation of Purusha. So in brief, it's that interpretive question, the question of how the Sāṃkhya ontology is relevant to the soteriological enterprise that in some way or other is common to Sāṃkhya and Yoga, that I seek to address in my book. Here, of course, I won't be able to address the question as comprehensively as I try to do in the book, but I'll at least say something concerning how I go about it. Some aspects of my approach are or ought to be fairly uncontroversial. Hence, for example, I consider it important to recognize that the Sāṃkhya Kārikā is itself a soteriologically oriented text. It explicitly claims in the opening Kārikā that the whole purpose of the philosophical inquiry is to eradicate or bring about a release from dukkha, suffering or dissatisfactoriness. So if we can't see a way in which the ontological system is relevant to achieving liberation, this would be an obvious problem for the coherence of the philosophy as a whole, or at any rate for the coherence of any interpretation of it. Close attention to the primary sources, namely the Sāṃkhya Kārikā and Patañjali Yoga Śāstra, is clearly important, as is attention to the traditional commentarial literature and to more recent secondary sources. And finally, on this list is the more innovative aspect of my approach, which is its comparative dimension. The idea being that it might be helpful to think in comparative terms, looking both at other Indian sources and at other areas of philosophy, including European philosophy. In any case, I perceived particular merits in drawing some comparisons with Abhidharma Buddhism, some aspects of the transcendental or critical philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and also the phenomenological philosophy of philosophers such as Franz Brentano and Edmund Husserl. Since, as I say, it's these comparisons that constitute the more innovative and in some ways contentious components of my approach, I'll devote the remainder of this talk to saying a little more about each of them. I'll begin with the phenomenological, then the Buddhist comparison, and I'll end with something about Immanuel Kant. Okay, so I don't claim that my interpretive approach is radically new, for I was picking up on some suggestions from others and developing those suggestions further. One interesting source is an essay by Judge Neshwar Ghosh, first published in 1936 as the introduction to a book by his teacher and guru, Swami Hariharananda Aranya. Ghosh, having encountered some work in European phenomenology, noticed the relevance. He characterizes Sāṃkhya's world, that is, its system of categories or ontological principles, as the world of experience. Sāṃkhya, he continues, knows nothing of any world or system of objects and events existing in independence of consciousness. Its method is, therefore, reflective analysis or systematic introspection. Now, I don't want to get too embroiled in the minutiae of phenomenological method, but important to mention is the notion of phenomenological reduction, developed in large part by Edmund Husserl. According to this method, in order to analyze the constituents of intentional consciousness, that is, the constituents of experience, one suspends or brackets the assumption that the items within one's experience have any reality outside or independently of consciousness. The philosophical analysis thus becomes an analysis of the field of experience, of how things appear to or in consciousness. Hence, the suggestion or comparative perspective that we saw from Ghosh turns us away from the interpretation of Sāṃkhya ontology as a cosmology or cosmogony, and towards the idea of it as, in some sense, an analysis of experience. Thinking of the ontology as the product of an analysis of experience not only ties in well with the patently non-cosmological nature of most of the Sāṃkhya tattvas as they are defined in the Sāṃkhya Kārikā, but it also brings out the relevance of the ontology to yoga practice. For if the goal of yoga is to relinquish all false identification with mental activities, then an analysis of experience is likely to yield an account of exactly what is to be disidentified with. A similar suggestion is made in a book by Braj Singha on time and temporality in Sāṃkhya Yoga and Abhidharma Buddhism. As he puts it, Sāṃkhya Yoga is primarily an attempt at a transcendental analysis of the facts of human experience. By a transcendental analysis, Singha means an analysis that aims to disclose the necessary conditions of human experience in a sense that draws upon both the Kantian and the phenomenological senses of the term transcendental. Roughly speaking, a transcendental analysis is designed to disclose the factors or principles that are transcendental in the sense that they are not themselves objects of experience, but are what have to be in place to enable experience to occur. And I'll return to this point in relation to Kant shortly. With these phenomenological suggestions in view, if we now return to the diagram of the manifestation of Prakriti that I showed earlier, we can more readily see how this ontological system can plausibly be construed as an analysis of the conditions of possible experience. For example, ahankara, that which produces egoity or a sense of individuation, is the necessary condition for there being any distinction between self and other, between oneself as a subject of experience and the items that crop up in one's experience. And buddhi is in turn a necessary condition for ahankara, since buddhi is the faculty of or capacity for having awareness of anything at all. It's the capacity for discerning things, which is why I render the concept in terms of intentional consciousness to convey the sense of directedness or aboutness, the capacity to have anything as an object or content of experience. And this fits with the definition of buddhi at Sāṃkhya Kārikā 23 as adhyavasaya, which can itself be translated as discernment or ascertainment, among other things. The intentional structure becomes all the more evident when we look to the principles that are themselves conditioned by ahankara and buddhi, especially the 5 sense capacities on the one hand and the 5 modes of sensory content or tanmatras on the other. The capacity to see is correlated with visible form or the content of visual experience. And thus we have a capacity for an intentional act, an act that grasps something as sensory content on the left side of the diagram, and the intentional content itself, in this case the sensory or visual content, on the right. And there's the capacity to hear, which is likewise correlated with sound or auditory content, and there's the smelling of odors and the tasting of flavors or tastes, and the capacity to have tactile sensations correlated with the tactile sensations themselves. And I hope that's relatively evident from the diagram there, looking from sort of left to right. And there's also manas, or mind, which is here the synthesizing faculty, which combines the various sensory phenomena into a coherent perceptual field, which is entirely consistent with Sāṃkhya Kārikā 27, where manas is defined in terms of sankalpa, which can be translated as construction or indeed as synthesis. And this leaves just the action capacities or karamendriyas and the bhutas or elements to be explained in this diagram. With regard to the bhutas, some suggestions from Abhidharma Buddhism, or at any rate from interpretations of Abhidharma Buddhism, can be helpful. Roughly speaking, Abhidharma is the branch of relatively early Buddhism that seeks to provide a systematic view of the Buddha's teachings, or dharma. And what the various schools of Abhidharma tend to do is to classify reality into its various constituent categories in a way comparable to certain other schools of Indian philosophy, including Sāṃkhya. And within the Abhidharma systems are the so-called great elements, or maha bhutas, which are equivalent to the first 4 of the 5 elements recognized by Sāṃkhya, namely earth, water, fire, and air. In interpretations of Abhidharma, it's common practice, or at least not very controversial, to think of these elements as characteristics of perceptual objects, that is, of how objects appear to us in perception. And as the interpreter Herbert Gunther puts it, quote, their names, that is, the names of the elements, have been derived from the objects which common sense assumes, although, he adds, the Buddhists never have the association of objects in our sense of the word. But here's the important bit for our present purposes. Earth, he says, is the symbolic expression for all that is solid and able to carry a load. Water for all that is fluid and cohesive. Fire for all that is light and moving. And then we might add to this the term air can stand for what is airy or gaseous. So if we look again at this diagram, we see how the having of sensory content, visible form, sound, and so on, is represented as making possible the experience of objects as hard or solid or earthy in that sense, or as fluid and moving, or as bright and hot or fiery, or as gaseous or cloudy, or indeed like a breeze or wind, which would be other possible understandings of the term vayu. And the final bhuta, namely akasha, can be thought of as space or spaciousness, which is itself a necessary condition for the arising of any of the others. Without space, there could be no perceptible objects at all. So again, it's difficult to make this entirely clear in a brief span of time, but I'm hoping that from what I've said and from the diagram, you can see how within the Sāṃkhya system, we've got this idea, on my interpretation at least, of the modes of sensory content, or tanmatras, as making possible the perception of objects, of objectual forms. Without those modes of sensory content, we couldn't have the kind of experience of perceptual objects that we do. And that's the sort of the gist of the connection that I'm seeing there. Okay. As for the 5 action capacities, these can certainly be understood as capacities to carry out certain types of action, but the fact that they include Ananda, which in Sāṃkhya Kārikā is identified with sexual pleasure or bliss, and hence as a type of feeling rather than a type of action, opens up the possibility of regarding all 5 of them as modes of experience as well as modes of engaging with the world. Thus, for example, in the case of speaking or vachana, we speak and also undergo the experience of speaking. We clasp objects and have the kinesthetic experience of clasping them. We walk or move about and have the kinesthetic sense of motion and the proprioceptive sense of our body's position in space. And we excrete things from the body and also have the experience of doing so. But now we still haven't accounted for the place of Purusha and Prakriti, or for the threefold structure of Prakriti at the root of this categorical system. So let's now turn to that. And this brings us in a way to Kant. Again, I'm not unique in supposing that a comparison with ideas from Kant might be useful. As J.N. Mohanty once noted, for example, albeit only in passing, one may make sense of the Sāṃkhya order of evolution by invoking some parts of the Kantian epistemology. And Mohanty was by no means the first to notice this. Kant's project, especially in the Critique of Pure Reason, published in the 1780s, was precisely to discover the necessary categories that make experience possible. And one of his principal methods of discovery was the transcendental argument, in which one begins by asking what needs to be in place for experience to occur as it does. And in response to this question, Kant arrives by means of rational reflection at a set of categories. As Kant says at one point, quote, the objective validity of the categories as a priori concepts rests on the fact that through them alone is experience possible. And by a priori concepts, he here means the conceptual categories that must be in place prior to experience in order for experience to be possible. Now, if we attach too much weight to the notion of conceptual categories here, the analogy between Kantian and Sāṃkhya philosophy could be misleading. But if we think more generally in terms of an analysis of simply the necessary conditions for experience to arise, the analogy can, I think, be helpful. Consider, for instance, verse 21 of the Sāṃkhya Kārikā, where the purpose of the coming together, the samyoga of Purusha and Prakriti, is announced. For the purpose of perceiving pradhana, it reads, and here pradhana can be treated as a synonym of Prakriti, and for the purpose of Purusha's liberation, Kaivalya, the two come together like the blind and the lame. That conjunction, samyoga, is kritaha sargaha, creation or creative emergence. Now, I wasn't going to dwell on the analogy of the blind and the lame, but we can return to that if anybody wants to. Hence, according to this passage, there are 2 purposes. One is the perceiving of Prakriti, or in other words, the having of experience, and the other is the liberation of Purusha. And Purusha can be liberated, can, as it were, abide in its own form, only through the process of differentiation, through the process of a realization of what Purusha is not, and what it is not is Prakriti. But if Prakriti were to remain imperceptible, then no differentiation could take place. Hence, Purusha and Prakriti and their mutual coming together or co-presence is the most basic necessary condition for experience to occur. It's the coming together of the sort of source of subjectivity and the source of objectivity, as it were. And why, we might ask, does Prakriti or Drishya, the seeable, have a threefold structure comprising the 3 gunas or strands? The most plausible answer is, again, that these components or qualities are necessary for anything to come into appearance or manifestation, to be an item of experience. As stated in Sutra 18 of the second chapter of the Yoga Sutra, the gunas are prakasha, also known as sattva, the quality of brightness or illumination or luminosity, kriya, also known as rajas, the quality of energy or activity, and sthiti, also known as tamas, the quality of stability, steadiness, or inertia. We might think of the first of these as the power to appear, the second as the power to expand and to be active and energetic, and the third as the power to resist and rein in that expansive energy, to prevent it becoming too dispersed and fragmented. And as Sāṃkhya Kārikā 12 and 13 put it, the three of these together serve to illuminate, activate, and restrain, functioning together like the parts of a lamp to, in effect, bring the world of experience into being. Now, in my book on this, I mention some ways in which an analogy, or rather some other ways in which an analogy with the Kantian method can be useful. But here all I'm doing is noting that approaching an interpretation of Sāṃkhya ontology through the transcendental question, namely the question of what has to be in place for experience to be possible, can help us to see why the basic dualism of Purusha and Prakriti is formulated as it is, and why Prakriti is said to be structured in the threefold way that it is or she is. Okay, so approaching some sort of conclusion here, summing up the relationship that I've been outlining, the relationship between yoga and Sāṃkhya, that is. So what is the purpose of yoga? Well, it might be characterized in terms of disidentifying with or detaching from or realizing one's non-identity with all possible objects or constituents of experience, including the very capacities that make experience possible, plus the unmanifest ground that underlies possible experience, namely Prakriti or unmanifest Prakriti. And what is the point or purpose of the system of categories set out in a text such as the Sāṃkhya Kārikā? Well, it is to provide an analysis of the constitutive conditions plus the unmanifest ground of all possible experience, that is, of precisely those things with which disidentification must be cultivated by means of yoga practice. And what yoga practice consists in is the rigorous control and simplification of experience through sustained meditation, thereby establishing the psychological environment in which the activities of the gunas can be observed and in turn detached from. And I'm going to end with the final sutra from the Yoga Śāstra, but also with some of the culminating verses of the Sāṃkhya Kārikā. So first, the final sutra, Sutra 34 of the fourth chapter of the Yoga Śāstra. It supplies a twofold definition of Kaivalya. First, Kaivalya, it affirms, is the returning to the source, the pratiprasava of the gunas, which are now devoid of any further purpose for Purusha. In other words, Kaivalya obtains when the fundamental constituents of all experiential content return to a state of unmanifest quiescence. Or, the sutra continues, Kaivalya is or can be defined as the establishment of the power of consciousness, chitti shakti, in its own form. Hence again, we have that notion of Purusha or the seer, or in this case, the power of consciousness abiding in its own form, a state of pure consciousness without content. And similarly, towards the end of the Sāṃkhya Kārikā, the attainment of Kaivalya is presented as a twofold event. Kārikā 65, for instance, draws upon a gendered figurative image in which Purusha is a spectator and Prakriti is a dancer or performer. Then Purusha, it reads, abiding in itself like a spectator, sees Prakriti, who has returned to inactivity and retreated from the seven forms or manifestation because her purpose is complete. I have seen her, says the spectating one. I have been seen, says the other, desisting. That is, desisting from activity and manifestation. And in Kārikā 68, we read that with the cessation of pradhana or prakriti, owing to its purpose having been fulfilled, Purusha, upon separating from the body, sharira, attains Kaivalya, which is both singular and conclusive. So again, we have the image of the abiding of Purusha, the seer or spectator, in its own form, combined with that of a cessation and withdrawal on the part of Prakriti, or that which is seen or seeable. It's as though the contemplative recognition of the fundamental distinction between pure consciousness on the one hand and everything that contributes to the undergoing of experiential content on the other results in the dissolution of the experiential content itself. And it's in that moment, according to both the Sāṃkhya of the Sāṃkhya Kārikā and the Sāṃkhya of Patañjali, that liberation occurs. And I better leave it there. So thank you all for your attention, and I'm going to end with a list of the references that I've been citing in case anybody's interested in those. Okay. And I'll stop sharing the screen. Okay, thanks.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mick. That was extremely clear. I'm no great philosophy expert, and I understood it all. So that was, it was a wonderful walkthrough of the main motifs of your book. I've got a few questions, but hang on, I haven't actually looked at the slide over a bit. But I'm going to chair's privilege. I shall ask one question certainly straight away. You did mention, I mean, in your talk, you were looking at how they complement the complementarity of Sāṃkhya and Yoga, really. And you did mention that perhaps there are some conflicts or contradictions. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that. And then I guess a kind of related question. I mean, we know, nowadays it's sort of assumed that Sāṃkhya and Yoga are paired together in the 6 darshanas, this Shad Darshana system. But I've looked into that a bit, and that actually doesn't come about until about the 13th century, I think. But then, of course, at the same time, in the Mahabharata, for example, Sāṃkhya and Yoga are often, paired and, seen as kind of almost two sides of the same coin. So I'm wondering, in the light of asking about contradictions and conflicts between the two systems, to what extent they were, how did they develop? Did they develop in dialogue? Did they develop independently? Is it possible to conceive of one without the other?
Right. Yeah, thanks for those questions, Jim. I'll start with the second of them, concerning the sort of the development of them. I mean, I'm no great expert on the history, but I think it's reasonable to think of this in terms of perhaps the image of a tree, where you've probably got some early roots, maybe back in the Upanishads and so on, where you've got certain Sāṃkhya and Yoga ideas sort of burgeoning. And it seems as though over time it became increasingly systematic. And then no doubt by the time that texts such as the Sāṃkhya Kārikā and Yoga Śāstra were being composed, there were almost certainly multiple different variations of Sāṃkhya philosophy. And these are just two sort of manifestations of that sort of complex mélange. And they happen to be ones that were picked up and commentated upon and have sort of lasted through to we still have access to them. And there are almost certainly multiple different versions that have become lost to history. And we have some sort of references to those in some of the commentaries. There's a commentary called the Yukti Dīpika, which is a particularly rich source of information about the sort of different teachers of Sāṃkhya that were around at the time of that text, or perhaps a little bit earlier, and these different lineages and traditions that developed. So I think that's a perfectly reasonable way of sort of envisaging the development of Sāṃkhya as like the branching of a tree from some original roots and so on. And so I would see what we find in the Sāṃkhya Kārikā and the Yoga Śāstra respectively as like branches on that tree. And so I think there's a sense in which they're related by their common origins, but not necessarily in the way that they were in neutral dialogue with each other. You know, I have no idea whether the compiler of the Yoga Śāstra was in any either contemporary dialogue or even had the Sāṃkhya Kārikā ready to hand or even the order in which they were composed. I don't know whether the Sāṃkhya Kārikā came first or the Yoga Śāstra came first. It seems as though, you know, the most prevalent view is that they were composed around about the same time, maybe sort of 4th or 5th centuries CE. But no doubt drawing upon earlier sources. So that, you know, that's roughly how I see the relationship. And then you were asking about the sort of differences between them. You use the term conflicts or contradictions. They're not actually the terms I would use, you know, because I do see them as being largely complementary. You know, I don't say any really striking contrasts or conflicts between them. I think there are differences of terminology, and hence that brings about a certain difference of emphasis. You know, there is a difference of emphasis on methodology within the Yoga Śāstra, because you've got actual instructions on meditation practice, albeit very, you know, pithy and concise, but we don't really find that in Sāṃkhya Kārikā. But my sense is that it's sort of implicit in the background in the Sāṃkhya Kārikā anyway. It's just that the text isn't focused on the more practical instructions. Now, you know, it might take a bit too much time if we were to go through all the sort of terminological nuances and perhaps even the conceptual ones. So let me just give one example, and it's the best known example, I think, which is the presence of the concept of Īśvara in the Yoga Śāstra, which is on the face of it absent from the Sāṃkhya Kārikā. And I use the qualification on the face of it because within the Yoga Śāstra, as we know, Īśvara is not defined as a distinct ontological principle, but rather as a special kind of Purusha. So if we take that seriously, then there's a sense in which, because there is a multiplicity of Purushas acknowledged within the Sāṃkhya Kārikā, as there is in the Yoga Śāstra, or at least if we, you know, consider the commentary as part of the text, then there's no obvious conflict there. It's just that there's a more elaborated account of this special type of Purusha being offered in the Yoga Śāstra. Now, what we find in the Sāṃkhya Kārikā is, towards the end, a reference to the Paramarshi, the highest seer or sage. And that is, you know, interestingly comparable to the notion of Purusha as Purusha. Sorry, a notion of Īśvara as Īśvara occurs in the Yoga Śāstra, especially when we see how that notion of Paramarshi is fleshed out in some of the commentaries, you know, where they talk about it as Kapila. Now, the term Kapila is not, well, I don't know, I'd have to look again. It is, I think the commentary on some of the sutras about Īśvara do make reference to Kapila, but whether they equate Kapila with Īśvara, I can't remember. I don't know whether you can.
Yeah, it rings a bell, but I'd have to look it up. Yeah.
Anyway, you know, I think there's so in a way, what I'm saying there is that even the most obvious and most often cited contrast between the Sāṃkhya Kārikā and the Yoga Śāstra is, when you burrow down into it, not such a vivid contrast at all. Now there's plenty of other little nuances and differences there, but I don't think they're radically different at all.
Okay, great, thank you. No, that was really good. So generally they're compatible. We can work with both. Okay.
I think so.
Thanks. Now we have got quite a few questions, I think. And also someone's raised their hand, Matthew Aldridge, but the way we do this, if you want to ask a question, you've got to put it on the Slido page, which, as I said earlier, the instructions for that came in the email about the event. Okay, so the top question at the moment from Ronwin said, but she's got no mic, so I shall read it out. Shanti Deva asks the Sankhyas how two unchanging entities, Purusha and Prakriti, can give rise to changeable entities like the bhutas, etc. Any thoughts?
Right. Okay. Well, I'm not fully familiar with Shantideva's critique of Sāṃkhya, but yeah, I think I could offer a response on behalf of Sāṃkhya. I'm not here to defend Sāṃkhya, but let's have a go. So, unchangeable. Yeah. Well, Prakriti is, in a sense, not unchangeable, because Prakriti in Prakriti's unmanifest form, in the avyakta form, is eternal and unmanifest. But Prakriti's constitution comprises the three gunas, the triguna, and these gunas are said to interact with one another, to have different preponderances in different different formations and so on. And it's precisely through that interaction, that mutual engagement between the three gunas, that the whole process of parinama, the manifestation of Prakriti's various forms, comes about. There are also, some interesting questions about whether this process of parinama, or transformation, of manifestation, is best conceived of in temporal terms or as a synchronic analysis. And in what I try to argue in my book is that there's at least a plausible case to be made for it being understood as a synchronic analysis, i.e., not a temporal sequence, but rather an analysis of the various relations of conditionality between the different constituent features of the ontological system. And if we approach it in that way, then, well, it's not really concerned with an account of how two principles at some point in time come together and give rise to something else, but it's rather making a claim about what has to be in place in order for other things to be there. And if we're approaching it from the standpoint of experience, then it's already here. We've got the experience, and what we're asking is, what are the conditions for that experience to occur, rather than giving an account in terms of a temporal chronological sequence of events. So there's a couple of answers that I would venture on behalf of Sāṃkhya, but I think that the key to it is that the transformative process is built into the very structure of Prakriti itself in the form of three gunas.
Great, thank you. Right now we've got an anonymous question, so I'll read this one out, then we've got some more that we can go to. Where do you think the direction of influence might be, if at all, between the categorizations of experience in Sāṃkhya and the Abhidharma of Buddhism?
This is another sort of historical question, isn't it? It's not something I've given an enormous amount of thought to be honest. So so the order of influence. I mean, I think I'm going to have to fudge it, because I don't know. So what I'm inclined to say is that this is sort of part of a broader milieu of Indian sort of thought and philosophy at that time, because the Abhidharma was almost certainly getting going before the end of the first millennium BCE, and then really came to the fore in the early centuries BCE. Similar kind of period that it looks like a similar kind of period that Sāṃkhya and Yoga were becoming more formulated as systematic philosophies. It's absolutely certain that there was dialogue going on between these different systems, different schools, different teachers of philosophy. So I don't know which came first. And I would need to look much more closely at the Abhidharma material than I have done in order to even try to make out any sort of lines of influence where it looks as though they're actually drawing upon the Sāṃkhya sources. So apologies for the vagueness, but no, I think it's all part of the general philosophical milieu at that time. Right.
Yeah, and I think it's a reasonably lively field as well, isn't it? The interactions between those different traditions at that time. We just had Dr. Karen O'Brien-Cott finished PhD at SOAS looking at exactly that, but there's a lot more work to be done, I think. So yeah, those questions maybe will be answerable in the future. Okay, next one, Ruth Westerby. So Ruth's given her name, so we can go to Ruth to ask her question, please.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much, Mick, for that presentation. That was really great. It made me realise how much I've just absorbed your phenomenological approach, and that's just the way I see it. So it was interesting that you were comparing the different approaches. Thank you. I know I've already asked you about this, the kind of gender thing, but I'd love to run it past you again if that's okay. Like how fundamental is the dancing girl metaphor, the kind of masculine and feminine to this, or is it just incidental because we can describe it as the blind and the lame, or the unknown calf drinking the milk? And I was listening to Jeffrey Ashton speak, and he was using Goethe's organics, in which case Purusha and Mula Prakriti are quite important as gendered, and then Prakriti is you know, coming together as a engendered aspect of that kind of, so it was those sort of things. Thank you ever so much.
No, thank you for the question. Yeah, it's this is a really interesting area of research at the moment. I think it's not just Jeff Ashton, but others are sort of working on, you know, from a feminist perspective. I know people who are working on this this sort of topic, and I don't know. I mean, you ask sort of how important is it? I mean, it's there. I think it's absolutely there and difficult to escape from. Certainly the Sāṃkhya Kārikā, it's a bit less pronounced perhaps in the Yoga Śāstra, but I think in Sāṃkhya philosophy as a whole, that gendered duality is very prominent, and I'd even go so far as to say that it has a very strong affinity with the whole sort of consort relationship between various deities, you know, within the whole Puranic genre, and in fact in Hindu religion more generally, where you have male deity paired up with female deity, and it's often the case that in some aspects of the mythology, at least, the male deity is characterized in terms of pure consciousness, and the female as Shakti, or energy. At least we know, I suppose, the relationship between Shiva and Shakti, Shiva and Durga, or Shiva and Parvati, etc., is the most obvious example of that. But in the case of other pairings of male and female deities, we find it as well. So, you know, this is why I think that that Sāṃkhya is one of the many reasons why I think Sāṃkhya philosophy is extremely important to study if one's interested in multiple different areas of Indic mythology, religiosity, and other areas of philosophy as well, because this pairing, this duality, comes through pretty strongly in multiple areas of traditional Indian culture, and so because of, you know, partly because of that, and because of that, what I would see as an influence of Sāṃkhya thought upon the formulation of mythological religious representations, I think it is very important, and yet, you know, there may well be some interesting modern contemporary perspectives from which it can be reflected upon in a critical manner, you know, maybe in terms of, you know, some gendered stereotypes and so on that might not be so helpful in political terms. But yeah, I think my short answer would be I see it as pretty close to being central to the whole Sāṃkhya system. A sort of this, you know, it's a binary, it's a dualism, and the dualism is bound up quite tightly, I think, with the gendered nature of the dualism, even though, as you rightly say, there are certain analogies or images that are used within the texts themselves which don't feature that obvious gendered aspect. And I can't remember whether that's how I answered your question last time you asked me, Ruth, but probably gave a very different answer. But anyway, that's what I think at the moment.
Thanks, and Ruth, has that answered your question about Mula Prakriti as well?
Yeah, I think it was quite tied in. You sort of covered that a little in the previous. Yeah. I mean, normally I see Mula Prakriti as part of Prakriti, so it was sort of whether we should see Mula Prakriti more as a correlate to Purusha rather than as part of the Prakriti side.
Yeah. Could I just add one more thing on this? Because I think, I think that the femininity, the femaleness of Prakriti is important also because of the sort of metaphor of giving birth. I think this is part. Prakriti is, to use the closest Latin equivalent, she is the procreatrix, which etymologically is pretty close to the Sanskrit Prakriti. She is the procreatrix. She is that which from which things come. She is the producing. She is that which gives birth to. On my interpretation, obviously to experience, but in a more cosmological sense, one could say she gives birth to the universe.
Great, thanks. We got 2 or 3 more. Anonymous one, I'll read out. Is there a difference between the sutra and the bhashya of the Patañjali Yoga Śāstra in how or whether they reference Sāṃkhyan ideas? I seem to remember that some scholars think there is.
Yeah, it's not easy to. I mean, in a sense, no. They both reference Sāṃkhya ideas. I think that there are the concepts of the duality of drashta and drishya, which are more or less synonymous with Purusha and Prakriti, and the constitution of drishya in terms of the 3 gunas, for example. And I think that multiple other examples that they're there in the sutras themselves. But I think obviously they're more elaborated in the commentary. The commentary is just a more elaborate, more filled out text. So in some places the Sāṃkhya references are all the more vivid and easy to spot in the commentary, but as I say, I think they're present in the sutras, and I've got no reason to disagree with the research of Philippe Maas on the Yoga Śāstra. He's made a very strong case for the sutras being incorporated within the commentarial portions of the text. So if that, as it seems, that account has got something going for it, then whoever composed the commentary was no doubt making deliberate selections. They may well have been pre-existing bits of text, but making deliberate selections, probably, I'd go as far as to say from perhaps a range of early Sāṃkhya sources. So they're going to have different emphases, maybe even different, well, they do, different terminology and to some extent different conceptual emphases, but sort of deliberately choosing various sutras to fit the purpose. And I think the composition as a whole is just pervasively Sāṃkhyan.
Great, thank you. We've got 2 more. The first one from Matthew Aldridge. So if we can go to him, please.
Oh, I've been unmuted, right? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Hi, Matthew.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. So my question is about, I've done some Buddhist studies, so I'm looking at it from the Buddhist aspect. So I found some references to this connection between tanmatras, which they don't call them tanmatras in the Buddhist system, and the bhutas, the elements, and the Vimuttimagga, which dates to about 100 BCE, mentions the same kind of connections between the senses and the elements, except for some slight differences on smell. So smell is related to Vayu, and touch is related to earth element. I just found that quite interesting, but otherwise it's more or less the same. The Visuddhimagga, which came much later, says that this is not found in any of the sutras, this concept, and it's an idea that the Mahasanghikas had, which was a distinct school from the early Theravada school. So it points to some early ideas in that area, which was quite interesting. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that or ideas or?
Well, no, thank you very much for the for that comment. Really, I mean, I don't have a lot to add, to be honest, because that's I think. Did you say it was the Vibhuti Magga?
The Vibhuti Magga, which is dated to about
Vibhuti Magga.
Yeah, and then the Visuddhimagga was written quite a lot later, but that's still, you know, fairly. I'm not sure the date on that one. And and the Visuddhimagga, I picked it up in front of me at the time. But it says some, however, say that the eye is sensitivity of primary elements that have fire in excess, and the ear, nose, and tongue are sensitivity of primary elements that have respectively air, earth, and water in excess, and that the body is that of all four equally. Others say, and it gives another example. So there's some difference of opinion as to which senses relate to which elements. And the commentary on the Visuddhimagga says that some are certain Mahasamgikas. For among these, Vasudhamma says this: in the eye, fire is in excess; in the ear, air; in the nose, earth; in the tongue, water; in the body, all are equal. So there's kind of like this whole concept. And I was wondering where it came from. It was accepted by some of the early Buddhist schools, which are now kind of somewhere. But yeah, anyway. I thought you might have some.
I think that's really helpful, and I mean I've got some familiarity with the Visuddhimagga, which is I think it's more like sort of 5th, 6th century CE. But you're mentioning an earlier text, which I'm certainly not familiar with, the Vibhuti Magga, and that sounds extremely interesting for my purposes. So I thank you for the comment and the suggestion, and I'm going to take a look at that. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks. Okay, so your last question, Mick, anonymous one. I shall read it out. Is Sāṃkhya an intellectual analysis where the practitioner stimulates the mind, and yoga is the quieting of the mind? How can they both? Maybe there's meant to be an if at the beginning, but so if Sāṃkhya is an intellectual analysis where the practitioner stimulates the mind, and yoga is the quieting of the mind, how can they both lead to the same goal?
Yeah, no, this is a good question concerning the question of whether the two schools, the two systems that we see represented in the Sāṃkhya Kārikā and Yoga Śāstra respectively, do indeed share a methodology. And I think there are two types of methodology that we need to bear in mind here. There's a sort of methodology that we might call the soteriological methodology, the methodology that's utilized in trying to attain the desired goal of liberation. And so I think this can be characterized in terms of meditation, but then there's also the methodology deployed in the composition of the texts themselves. So it's not as though, I don't envisage it being like this, as though somebody was sort of sitting in sustained meditation, comes out of the meditation, has having had a great revelation, and then scribbles it all down on a parchment. Not like that, So I think in the composition of both texts, there's a lot of intellectual analysis going on, and yet it's intellectual analysis that involves reflecting upon the practice. And I think this is this is the relationship between the two. So when you, the question askers, say that or characterize Sāṃkhya method in terms of intellectual analysis, I don't think there's an obvious contrast between that and the way in which the Yoga Śāstra is composed. They both involve that intellectual analysis. So there's only a contrast or a tension or a conflict there if we assume that the intellectual analysis carries over into the soteriological practice that's sort of underlying the Sāṃkhya Kārikā itself. Whereas if we think of the Sāṃkhya Kārikā text as an exposition of the analysis of the various constituents of experience that one is able to discern and gain a deeper insight into through the meditative practice, then I don't think there's a tension or a conflict here. Now, I don't think the question of what's the soteriological methodology of Sāṃkhya can really be easily resolved merely by reading the Sāṃkhya Kārikā. But if we read some of the commentaries, and especially, again, I'm thinking of the Yukti Dīpika here, can't point, just off the top of my head, can't point to specific passages, but there's a lot more suggestions of a commonality of what I'm here calling soteriological method. So, for example, the Yukti Dīpika makes explicit reference to the sort of complementarity of non-attachment and practice. So, practice abhyasa and non-attachment vairagya, which is precisely the two components of yoga practice that are really strongly emphasized around about some of the quite early sutras in the first pada. And this is the Yukti Dīpika is a commentary on the Sāṃkhya Kārikā, and it's relating those two aspects, the non-attachment and the abhyasa. Tattva abhyasa, as it's known in Samkhya, the practice of the discernment of the various, again, to use my sort of terminology, constitutive conditions of possible experience. And so where am I going with this? I'm saying that yeah, I don't think we've got good reason to think that there's a striking contrast in methodological approach.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mick. We're bang on time. That's perfect. The questions are all done. Maybe you've got a bit of time to go out in some evening sunshine as well. So,
Great.
Lovely. Yeah. Thank you very much. So what we're going to do now, everyone will unmute, or everyone will be unmuted, and we're going to say thank you very much. And we hope we get you back again soon, and hope we can see you in person as well before too long.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.